Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming through a feminist lens. Today I'm your host and I'm with my friend Alex.
Hello.
Hello Alex, and Jem.
Hi.
Hello both of you. Today we're going to be talking about the second part of our series on semantics, gender language and censorship. We're going to be talking about censorship. We talk a lot about the things that we don't like, things that need to change, things that need to just go away entirely. But what should actually be done about those things, if anything should be done? That's the question, because none of us have the power to change things like Superman. But what would we do if we should? Should we have the power? Should anyone have the power? But before we get into that, you can support us if you want to financially through either one-off payment to PayPal, sending it to wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com, or we have a Patreon page with some exclusive content, which is patreon.com/gamingthesystem. So, censorship in the gaming world. First off, what is censorship in the gaming world? What form does censorship take?
I suppose if I had, this is completely uneducated guess, by the way, but if I had to say, I'd say it's pretty similar, or at least it started out as being quite similar to the film industry, where they would give games certificates based on the age rating, and kind of censor them or provide warnings in that way for levels of violence, sexual content, blood and gore is a popular one, things like that. And they would be mentioned in the list of things to look that would be included in the game that you need to be aware of. And they'd also have an age certificate. Is that's still a thing in games, isn't it? I just haven't been paying attention since I've become an adult, that's all. Yeah. So I remember when I was young, obviously, it was my mum mainly who was buying games for me. So she would use those as a kind of guide to figure out what games would have suitable content in them. Although having said that, as you all know, I was exposed to Tomb Raider from a very young age, which probably wasn't appropriate content for a primary school aged child to be spending time watching. But yeah, that's my very uneducated guess at what censorship involves.
Well, I mean, it's basically some people decide what is and isn't acceptable, and then they inflict that or enforce that on other people. And that can be to varying extremes, and it can be problematic or it can be pragmatic. I think censorship in itself isn't the problem. I think it's the way that it's enforced and the reasons that it's enforced, why it's enforced, that can be a problem. As you say, things like certificates on games and movies is a form of censorship, in that it's I don't know if it is a form of censorship. It can be used for censorship by, as you're in your example of parents. Certainly, I've done that with my daughter. This is certified 18, therefore we can't watch it. So it's a guide that's then used as censorship. So I suspect that we all censor ourselves and others at various points in our lives, and I think we've probably all been censored in various ways. So yeah, I'm interested to see how this conversation pans out, because I as I said, I don't think censorship in and of itself is a problem. I think it's the It's the way that it's implemented that can be a problem.
Yeah, I think the word acceptability is a core component of this, because what is acceptable in society changes. And it used to be acceptable to call black people Negroes, and now that's not acceptable. And some people, it's still acceptable to say the N-word in some groups of people, but in general it's not. And I think I'm not sure about what the situation should be between acceptability and censorship, because censorship is too often, it's a weapon used by the powerful to disempower and scuttle the power of people who have less power. And I'll go to my next question. So we've talked a little bit about age ratings. I think age ratings are good, as like with the best thing I can think of so far is they're basically trigger warnings. And as long as someone knows what's inside something, then they can choose whether to expose themselves to it. But that doesn't have any impact on the creator. So the creator has free range to create anything. And then the consumer has the choice, the informed choice of whether or not to experience it. So two things that I thought about in terms of censorship. So we'll start off talking about, so there's sort of socially acceptable censorship, which is the public not wanting to see or experience something because it's unacceptable to the public, and then we'll come on to government censorship, which is the government telling people what they are allowed and not allowed to say or do. So from the perspective of the gamer, should there be a system of censorship in the game creation process?
That's an interesting question. Go on, Jim.
Yeah. Shall I go? Or are you going to go?
There you go.
It's okay. So I should probably have said this in the earlier episode, but if you look at research into gendered language, it does have a significantly negative impact when gendered language is used. So, for example, with regards to studying maths, when maths and science subjects are explained using gendered terminology, it has a negative impact on the achievement of the girls that are exposed to that. So because they begin to associate the maths with being a male thing and not for girls, so it alienates them and makes them feel that it's not for them. And as we all know, self-confidence and confidence is 90% of the issue when it comes to learning things and succeeding at things. Believing that you can do something, or that you have an opportunity to do something, is a massive part of people's ability to actually do those things and to achieve. And we also know that when it comes to advertising products, if boys see girls playing with a toy, they won't buy it. They don't want it. Whereas if girls see boys playing with a toy, then then it has no effect on whether or not they'll buy it. It certainly doesn't turn them off. And this is all linked into what we've discussed about the idea of like girls being girl being kind of shorthand for rubbish, and boy being shorthand for good. And so I think that when it comes to the game world, then censorship is actually quite an important thing at times, because we have to think about the ways that we're saying things and the things that we're saying and the reasons that we're doing them and why we're doing them. So I think when it comes to language and how much swearing there is and what sort of swear words are used, then censorship at a design level, it is something that should be being considered. And we talked earlier about how we can be creative in our insults and our ways of sort of being mean, and I think that's something that for me, sort of saying to people, okay, these words cannot be used in this game, is going to encourage people to come up with more creative ways of saying that. And so, for example, I mean, Battlestar Galactica, obviously not a computer game, TV series, they introduced this whole concept of like frack instead of the other F word, and they used that all the way through, and it was clear what they were actually saying, but it didn't feel so impactful in a inappropriate way. So and that was censorship. That was probably something that was put down, from the start, that somebody said, right, we want this to go out in this time slot on this channel, and we don't allow swearing of this, so they went, okay, and they came up with an alternative way around it. And in some ways maybe that's silly, but in other ways maybe it's okay, because it allows them to still make their point, but they're not using this language. And I think the same applies to violence, gratuitous violence. It's okay, I think, for somebody to say at the design level, no, we're not going to use gratuitous violence, but we do still want to portray violence. So how do we go about doing that? How do we go about these scenes? And I think that's not a bad thing from a creative perspective, actually. I think, we do have to make clever decisions, and it stops people from being lazy at those levels.
Jumping onto your point there, Jim, about being creative and finding different ways of portraying different things, it's almost like just making content more accessible for as wide an audience as possible. What things can we do that are going to engage this larger audience and not alienate them in different ways? What content is appropriate for a wide audience? And it's these kinds of questions that game devs and creators and writers probably should be asking themselves. And censorship, as we said, is there'll always be the argument from some people being like, oh, censorship is crushing our creative spirit and all this. But actually, it might be more creative to think of workarounds. It's the same way that a lot, when you think about adapting different in your workplace, for example, or like just generally day to day. As a disabled person, I adapt a lot of things I do to make the world work for me, because it's not designed for me as a wheelchair user. And so I have to be very resourceful and creative in coming up with ways of navigating it that work for me. And so, I think it could, in fact, lead to a more creative process if you're trying to think of a way to make your content acceptable and accessible to as wide an audience as possible, which of course makes business sense, because you want your game to sell lots and make lots of money. Interesting point also you mentioned about gendered language again, and science and maths. I just wanted to it made me think of when I was studying languages in A-levels and in university. I studied ancient languages, so Latin, ancient Greek and Middle Egyptian. And some of the older textbooks, going back to the sort of 60s, 70s, even the 80s, and further back than that, obviously. Some of them were from like the early 1900s. All of the language in them talking about how to learn the language was like, the student will find that he, blah, 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 blah. And it was all he, his, and all this. And it was as if it was saying, well, only boys get to learn these languages because they go to nice elite private schools. That's where they learn all the classics. And only boys have the privilege to learn hieroglyphs and all this sort of stuff. And it just made me think, well, what a load of crap. That doesn't, yeah. And it just shows how, obviously nowadays, if a dictionary was printed or a guide to grammar on a language, you'd hope it would say, students will find that they blah, 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 rather than having this gendered phrasing. But it just definitely sent that message, and that is how society has been structured for decades and decades. This is the legacy that we're trying to undo at the moment.
Yeah.
I think neutral language is one of the most powerful tools that we can use in dismantling gender stereotypes, because when there's no excuse for not using neutral language in textbooks, because the minute they go, oh, it all says he, oh, but we've got girls learning this as well. You go, okay, well, he or she then, okay, but what about gender non-conforming people? Then they've got to make the choice of, no, they're wrong. Gender non-binary people are wrong, so we're not going to put them in here. Then that tells you something about the person making the book. But that's just madness, because you can go, well, that's just a thing. I might not necessarily understand it, but it is a thing. So what's the way that we could do it? So, we'll have it in the neutral. So everything is they and them. And then that solves every problem in that textbook. You put they, them, they, them, they, them, they, them. And then anyone who picks out that textbook is going to go, oh, yeah, this is for me. And then that means that it takes a tool out of the patriarchy's toolbox of how it can condition people. Because if you read for your entire school life, they, them, they, them, they, them, they, them, you're not going to have any gendered, well, you're going to have far fewer gendered preconceptions about life. And then if someone tries to apply those kinds of words to it, you're going to go, why are you saying that only boys do that or only girls do that? I've got this book and it just says they, them all the way through. And you go, no, you don't understand. Girls are meant to be nurses. They're not meant to be doctors. Why? That's my aunt is a doctor and my uncle's a nurse. And then that's the unraveling of the patriarchy's semantic power structure, which I think is powerful.
Absolutely. And I mean, people would claim that was censorship, though. If you said, right, all school grade books have to refer to they and them. I mean, I'm always surprised that at my daughter's school, when we get an email from them, they say your sons and daughters. I'm just like, why don't you just say your children or your charges or your, why do they need to say sons and daughters? I mean, there are, because that exactly, and it immediately excludes anyone who doesn't identify as he or she, and it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to. It's in those sort of scenarios, the gender of the person that you're talking about is entirely irrelevant, and therefore doesn't need to be mentioned in any way. So it always surprises me how much that happens. But I also think that if you said, everything needs to be referred to as they, you'd have, the Liz Trusses of the world coming out and complaining that it was the wokerati who were, out there trying to censor, the right wing and the working man, there's this argument about censorship as censorship is a rude word, as a bad word, but actually, we are censoring what we say every single day, all the time. We don't walk into a room and immediately say the first thing that pops into our head. If somebody comes in and says, "How do I look in this outfit?" and you're like, "Oh my God, you look ridiculous," that's not what you say. You might say, "I think maybe that top doesn't go with those trousers," or whatever. But we're always censoring ourselves, and it comes back to my original point about it's not being censorship that's the problem. It's just being about who is employing it and for what reasons and what motivations. And I think there is there's a censorship often gets sort of lumped in with the idea of freedom of speech. And I think what you were saying earlier, Alex, about I think it was you, might have been saying about certification in games being a good thing because it means that the designers can choose. It doesn't affect their ability to how they design the game. It just affects us the next stage on. So you're not saying you can't have violence in your game or you can't have swearing in your game. It's saying, if you do, it will reduce the audience that you are able to sell your game to. And that's a choice that you might want to make. As an adult who likes things like, scary horror and science fiction and stuff, I have to say that I've been really pleased when some stories have come along and definitely had their 18 rating. I was really delighted when True Blood came along after years of having Twilight vampires. Suddenly I have True Blood where it's all sex and violence and they weren't pulling very many punches. I was like, excellent, I can watch something that isn't for tweens, but is something that I enjoy. And I feel the same way about Baldur's Gate and their sex scenes. It's like, even though some of them make me feel a bit awkward, it's like, I think that's fine. And as an adult, I can do that. But it does also mean that their games are not necessarily suitable for younger people. And that's just the choices that we make every day, I think.
No, it's interesting, definitely, to think about. I've got something I wanted to share with you guys just quickly. But before that, while we were talking about gendered language in textbooks in schools, actually another recent example of where I've seen it is in board game instructions, where it refers to the player as he. Have you guys seen that before?
That's horrible.
That comes up quite a lot. So that's a direct link there to gaming and an immediate change that could be made there to make it a more neutral and more inclusive experience is to just use they instead of the player must roll his dice, etc. But the thing I wanted to share comes back to harmful content in gaming. And you might remember recently the Tomb Raider classics 1 to 3 have been remastered and released in the middle of February. As I loaded up the game for the first time, a content warning came up onto the screen and I started reading it. And about 2 seconds later it disappeared, so I didn't have time to read it all. And then I looked it up online because, of course, the game was obviously keen for me to either read at lightning speed or not to pay any attention to it at all. And I just wanted to read it to you guys because I think it's really interesting. And it says, the games in this collection contain offensive depictions of people and cultures rooted in racial and ethnic prejudices. These stereotypes are deeply harmful, inexcusable, and do not align with our values at Crystal Dynamics. Rather than removing this content, we have chosen to present it here in its original form, unaltered, in the hopes that we may acknowledge its harmful impact and learn from it. but I didn't actually have time to read it all when I booted up the game, and each time I reboot it up, it doesn't appear, which I thought was interesting in and of itself. But what do you guys think about that statement?
I think that's the way to approach older things, because when we think about the scale of acceptability, there are things that in a game of like what is acceptable. There are like gladiator, every Napoleonic, like every film ever about any kind of empire. Every empire has been built on the back of slavery. There hasn't been a single empire in history where they haven't used massive amounts of slave labor. And so when you have a film that centers on a hero, for example, Gladiator, Maximus Decimus Meridius, he's completely fine with slaves. He's always been completely fine with slaves. All these noble people in all these films are all completely fine with slaves. That's just true. But you can still paint them in this way as they have done forever. But I think one thing that another useful thing from union organising is they've got the idea of inoculation against anti-union tactics. So when you tell someone, get them on board with union work, that person has never done anything about union before, they're going to go back into work. And then a union bus might come around and say, oh yeah, they just want you. They're not on your side. They just want better things for themselves. They're going to try and use you. But the trick is, before that happens, when you're talking to them, you say, okay, so this is a list of the things that union buses do to try and get you to not be part of the effort. And you go, there's this, and this. So you're on the lookout for it. So when it happens, you've got the self-awareness to go, oh yeah, I recognize that, and that. Now, and so when, rather than saying, right, you can't do this, or saying to Tomb Raider, you will try and change it, or to change it, but then that's not the way it was. A lot of the further you go back, the worse the
there's some pretty
the
bad
insults
things.
and things. Yeah. So there's always going to be an argument for anything that would be censor worthy. But I think that when it comes to freedom of speech, so we haven't got time to go on to government censorship. So we'll just talk for a few more minutes about censorship in terms of consumers and what's good for business. There's difference between things being unacceptable to say and things that you're not allowed to say, because people have thoughts and feelings, and whether or not they're allowed to say the words or say them doesn't fix the feelings. And the clearest thing is with men and violence. You're not going to be able to stop men being violent, because you can't just chain us all to a bench or cull us as you would like, Jem. I
did not say that.
Yeah. So the answer is in why do men have these thoughts and feelings of violence? And just saying to men, clearly the law is that you're not allowed to be violent. That hasn't worked. And so that's the difficult conversation to be had. Have you heard the word libtard?
Yeah.
No, but I can gather what it means and where it's taken from.
Yeah. So the word used to be the official word for people with disabilities, but now it's not. It's an acceptable thing to say, but right-wing people use it a lot because that's what it means. That's what they mean by it, and so they're allowed to get it out themselves in that way. But if there wasn't a way for them to say it, they would still have that feeling. But the thing is, when you inoculate someone against that, you go, oh, when they say that, it's got nothing to do with politics. They want to call, or their political position, they want to call someone this word because that makes them feel good. And then when you hear them say it, you go, oh, I know this has nothing to do with politics, which is what I was trying to talk to them about. So I can't reach them on that. And then that comes to freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. So when it comes to stuff, so anyone on the street can say that to a random person. It's bad, but they've got the freedom to say it. But then everyone around them will look at them and go, why the hell did you say that? When it's said in a workplace, you can say it, but then you'll lose your job. If you said that to someone, you didn't even necessarily have to be disabled. You say that R word to someone in the workplace, you're at the very least going to get disciplined. And if it's when you're in textbooks or in game manuals, then that the best thing you can do with those things is, just neutralize it, play it safe and neutralize it. Because if it's neutral, then you can't really argue with that unless you're a right-wing person or a transphobic person. Because the worst thing that is, one of the most damning things for anti-trans people is personal pronouns. Because there has never been a simpler way to ally yourself with trans and non-binary people than to just simply put your pronouns after your name. That means trans and non-binary people are safe here. And that takes a tremendous amount of power out of the anti-trans people's movement, because there are clearer signposts of, oh yeah, they're safe, you're safe here, you're safe here. And that's another reason why the pride flag now has the trans colours on them. So that means that this flag is safe, you're safe here. We'll come on to one more question, I think. Which one to go for? You know what? We'll cut it there. We've got a clear cut on to another question, so we'll just bring it to a close. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We release something new every Thursday. And if you want to support us, you can do so on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/gamingthesystem for some exclusive content. Or you can send us a donation to our PayPal at wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com. Until next time, thank you for listening or watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Gaming the System. If you want to support us, you can donate to us through our PayPal by sending it to wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com if you want to send us a one-off donation. If you want to donate to us monthly, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem. Until next time, bye-bye.